High above Europe, where the air is thin and the cold bites through steel, young men once fought a war few could imagine. They were bomber crews, barely out of their teens, sent to fly 10-hour missions through skies filled with death. Inside those flying fortresses and heavy bombers, the temperature dropped to 40 below zero. Oxygen masks froze, engines roared, and every heartbeat was a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. They faced the flak first, walls of bursting metal that tore through wings and flesh alike. Then came the German fighters, swift, merciless, and determined to stop them before they reached their targets. Yet somehow, mission after mission, these men climbed back into their aircraft and did it again. They weren't flying for glory. They flew because they had to, because someone had to. And in doing so, they helped turn the tide of World War II. This is their story of courage in the freezing skies, of fear, friendship, and endurance beyond belief. When most people think of World War II, they picture tanks, infantry, or ships. But thousands of young men fought their war thousands of feet above the ground, in the icy, thin air of the European skies. These were the bomber crews, the pilots, gunners, navigators, and engineers who climbed into roaring metal giants like the American B-17 Flying Fortress, B-24 Liberator, and Britain's Avro Lancaster. Their mission was to fly deep into enemy territory, often for more than 10 hours at a time, and deliver their payloads on factories, rail yards, and cities vital to the German war machine. Every mission began long before takeoff. Crews woke before dawn, shivering in the English cold, gathering for briefings that revealed their targets, sometimes Berlin, sometimes the oil fields of Ploiești, or the U-boat pens of Hamburg. The men would study maps, wind speeds, and flak zones, their faces lit by dim lamps as officers detailed every hazard they'd encounter. They knew what the odds were. Casualty rates for bomber crews were among the highest of the war. Many would not return. The airmen were young, most in their early 20s, some barely 18. They came from farms, cities, and schools, thrust together into tight-knit crews that depended entirely on one another for survival. Each had a vital role: the pilot steering the aircraft through storms of flak, the navigator charting courses by starlight, the bombardier timing his drop to the second, and the gunners scanning for deadly Luftwaffe fighters that could strike from any direction. Despite the terror ahead, there was pride. These men believed their missions could shorten the war, cripple German industry, and save lives on the ground. They called themselves the boys who flew, but the skies would soon make them into hardened veterans. Each time they boarded the bomber, they faced not only the enemy, but freezing temperatures, exhaustion, and the constant question of whether they'd make it home. For them, the war wasn't fought in trenches or jungles. It was fought in the thin, frozen air, inside a vibrating steel fortress miles above the earth, where courage, teamwork, and fate decided who lived to see another dawn. For bomber crews, survival began long before the first engine roared to life. Every flight required meticulous preparation, not just for the aircraft, but for the men inside it. A single forgotten tool, a missed inspection, or a moment of carelessness could turn a mission into a death sentence. At dawn, the airfields across England came alive with movement. Mechanics worked in the bitter cold, their breath visible in the frosty air as they checked the 4 massive engines of each bomber. Oil leaks, ice buildup, and hydraulic failures were constant threats. Ground crews loaded thousands of pounds of bombs, 500-pounders for precision targets, or massive 4,000-pound cookies used by British Lancasters to shatter city centers. The bomb bays were carefully calibrated. A misaligned rack could jam, preventing release mid-flight. Meanwhile, inside briefing rooms, the air crews gathered around large maps. Red strings traced routes across Europe, over enemy radar nets, flak zones, and fighter corridors. They memorized landmarks and emergency landing fields in case they couldn't make it back. A quiet tension filled the air as the commanding officer pointed to the day's target. Perhaps the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt or the synthetic fuel plants of Luna. The crews knew what that meant: heavy resistance and long odds. After the briefing came the ritual of suiting up. The men layered themselves in electrically heated flight suits, fleece-lined jackets, and heavy gloves. Oxygen masks and parachutes were double-checked. At altitude, the temperature could drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and a torn glove or frozen mask could mean frostbite or death. Gunners carried .50 caliber ammunition belts slung over their shoulders like bandoliers, preparing for the inevitable swarm of German fighters. Outside, the bombers stood lined up on the runways, their metal skins gleaming in the gray morning light. Engines sputtered to life one by one, sending waves of vibration through the ground. Pilots checked controls while co-pilots verified the fuel and oxygen systems. Every checklist item mattered. Even a small mistake could doom the entire crew once they were airborne. Then came the signal. Flares arced through the sky. Propellers roared in unison as the formation began to roll forward. Dust and snow kicked up behind the wheels. The crews exchanged quick glances, nods, prayers, small jokes, anything to mask the fear. As the bombers lifted off the ground and climbed toward the clouds, England fell away beneath them, and the long, deadly journey began. Once airborne, the crews entered a world unlike anything on Earth, a realm of noise, vibration, and freezing cold. The B-17s, B-24s, and Lancasters climbed steadily, their engines thundering in perfect rhythm as the formations assembled over the English countryside. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of bombers joined in formation, creating massive armadas of metal that stretched across the horizon. From below, the sunlight glinted off their silver bodies, a symbol of Allied power. But to the men inside, it was the start of 10 relentless hours in sub-zero temperatures where even breathing could be agony. At altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the air was thin and temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen masks were mandatory, and the cold seeped through every layer of clothing. The heated flight suits often malfunctioned, leaving gunners shivering inside their turrets. Frost formed on the inside of windshields and gun sights. If bare skin touched metal, it would freeze instantly. Even coffee froze solid within minutes. The interior of the bombers was a world of extremes. The noise was deafening, a constant roar from the engines that made communication almost impossible. The intercom system became the lifeline. A few garbled words could mean life or death. Each man knew his job and trusted the others completely. The pilot and co-pilot kept the plane steady. The navigator calculated the route using maps and stars. The bombardier prepared his Norden bomb sight, and the gunners scanned the skies for the enemy. They flew in tight formation for protection, each bomber covering another with overlapping fields of fire. It took discipline and precision to maintain these formations in turbulence or cloud cover. A single plane that drifted off course risked collision or being picked off by German fighters. The men watched for the telltale trails of condensation that could reveal their position to the enemy below. As they crossed the English Channel and approached enemy territory, a tense silence often filled the intercom. Everyone knew what came next: flak and fighters. The cold, the altitude, the fear, all of it built toward that moment when the sky would erupt in chaos. Yet even knowing this, they pressed on. For many, the act of simply staying focused, adjusting the oxygen flow, checking gun belts, monitoring gauges, was a way to hold back the fear that never left them. They weren't just flying, they were surviving, minute by minute, in a sky that seemed determined to kill them. As the bomber streams crossed into occupied Europe, the once clear skies turned deadly. Below them, German cities and military installations were shielded by layers of anti-aircraft guns, each one waiting to fill the heavens with exploding steel. To the men inside the bombers, this was known simply as the flak zone. Flak, short for Flugabwehrkanone, meaning air defense cannon, was the greatest fear of bomber crews. The black bursts of smoke looked almost beautiful from a distance, but inside a formation they were terrifying explosions of shrapnel. The shells detonated at preset altitudes, sending thousands of razor-sharp fragments spinning through the air. A single hit could shred an engine, puncture a fuel tank, or kill a crewman instantly. As the bombers approached their targets, the sky grew thick with bursting shells. Pilots gripped the controls while the aircraft shuddered violently, each explosion threatening to tear it apart. Oxygen masks rattled, gauges danced, and shards of plexiglass sprayed the cabin. The gunners, chained to their positions, could do little but watch as the deadly puffs closed in. The air smelled of cordite, sweat, and freezing metal. Communication through the intercom turned frantic. "Number 3 engine hit! We've got a fuel leak! Navigator's down!" Every mission brought chaos, and survival depended on quick thinking and teamwork. Crews used feathering controls to shut down damaged engines, rerouting hydraulic systems, or manually cranked landing gear just to stay airborne. In those moments, training became instinct, and instinct meant the difference between life and death. For the British crews flying nighttime raids, flak came with an added terror: searchlights. Dozens of blinding white beams pierced the darkness, sweeping the sky to trap bombers in their glare. Once caught, every gun on the ground opened fire. Pilots would dive, twist, and turn desperately to escape, their planes glowing like ghosts against the blackness. Some evaded the lights, others vanished in fireballs that lit up the clouds. Despite the noise, the fear, and the explosions tearing the air apart, the bombers pressed forward. Each man clung to his post, hands frozen, heart pounding, praying the next shell would miss. And through it all, they could see their target approaching in the distance: the factories, refineries, and rail lines they'd come to destroy. The mission was only halfway through, but already the sky behind them was full of smoke, fire, and falling planes. Once the bombers broke through the flak fields, they faced a new nightmare: the Luftwaffe. Germany's air force, though weakened by 1944, was still fierce, and its fighter pilots were among the most skilled in the world. They knew exactly how to attack: fast, coordinated, and merciless. From the moment radar stations spotted the bomber formations crossing the coast, squadrons of Bf-109s and FW-190s scrambled from airfields across northern France and western Germany. Their mission was simple: destroy as many bombers as possible before they reached their targets. Each fighter carried 20mm cannons or heavy machine guns capable of tearing through a bomber's fuselage in seconds. For the men inside the bombers, the first warning was usually a shout over the intercom: "Bandits, 11 o'clock high!" Then the gunners' world exploded into chaos. Fighters dove out of the sun, guns blazing, tracer rounds streaking red and orange across the blue. The bombers returned fire with everything they had: 50 caliber machine guns spraying thousands of rounds into the sky. The gunner's job was brutal. The tail gunner, isolated in a cramped bubble at the back of the plane, had to track enemy aircraft closing in at over 400 miles per hour. The top turret gunner rotated his dome, trying to keep enemies off both wings. Waist gunners fired out of open windows, the freezing wind whipping at their faces as they fought to keep formation intact. Each attack lasted only seconds, but it felt endless. The sky was filled with debris, chunks of aluminum, trails of smoke, and burning planes spiraling down. If a bomber caught fire, there was little hope. Sometimes the crew bailed out, other times the plane simply disintegrated. Yet, incredibly, the formations held. The discipline and training drilled into these men kept them flying straight, even as the world around them fell apart. By 1944, American P-51 Mustang escorts had begun accompanying the bombers all the way to their targets, changing everything. The sleek Mustangs, faster and more agile than the German fighters, dove into dogfights that raged across the sky. Bomber crews cheered when they saw the silver planes with red or yellow noses swoop in. It meant they might live to see another sunrise. Still, not every crew was so lucky. For every raid that returned, dozens of planes failed to make it back. Yet, mission after mission, they kept flying, determined to bring the war to an end, no matter the cost. After surviving the gauntlet of flak and fighters, the bomber crews still faced the most dangerous part of the mission, the bomb run. This was where precision mattered most, and where they were most vulnerable. For several crucial minutes, the planes had to fly straight and level, no evasive maneuvers, no turns, no diving, just a steady line toward the target, right through hell. The lead bombardier was the key. In the nose of the plane sat the Norden bomb sight, a piece of technology so advanced that crews joked it could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel. The bombardier took control of the aircraft during the final approach, guiding the pilot with minute corrections. Everyone else in the plane knew that, for those few minutes, their fate rested in his hands. The tension was unbearable. The intercom went quiet, except for the bombardier's voice calling out headings. The pilot adjusted the yoke, the engines roared evenly, and outside, black smoke puffed around them as more flak exploded nearby. The smell of cordite filled the fuselage. Each man prayed silently, eyes locked on the target through narrow slits or glass panels. When the bombardier finally called, "Bombs away!" the entire plane jolted upward, lighter by thousands of pounds. A few seconds later, the bombardier looked back through the sight and saw the payload tumbling toward the target, a factory, a rail yard, or an airfield already blanketed with smoke from other waves. But their job wasn't done. The bombers had to hold course for another 30 seconds, long enough for the bomb site's gyroscopes to stabilize the drop. Those seconds felt like hours. Every man knew that German gunners were aiming for them, and enemy fighters were still prowling nearby. Finally, the pilot shouted, "Let's get out of here!" The formation banked hard, engines straining as the bombers turned for home. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but it was short-lived. The return flight would be just as long and just as deadly. Still, as they looked out the windows and saw the smoke rising from below, the crews felt something powerful. They had struck a blow at the heart of the enemy. Every mission carried a cost, but they believed it would shorten the war and bring peace that much closer. For the men of the 8th Air Force and Bomber Command, that belief was what kept them going, through fear, fatigue, and loss, one mission at a time. The bomb run was over, but the journey home was a battle of its own. Once the bombs were dropped, the bombers had to fly hundreds of miles back across enemy territory, still hunted, still vulnerable, and often damaged. The adrenaline that had carried them through the attack began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and dread. Engines coughed, holes riddled the fuselage. Sometimes one wing would be half torn, and the control cables frayed. The navigator would call out bearings, trying to guide the crew home through thick clouds of smoke and flak haze. Inside, it was cold, quiet, and tense. Every man listening for strange noises that might mean another engine was failing. The Luftwaffe wasn't done yet. Fighter groups waited to pounce on retreating bombers, especially those that had fallen behind formation. Stragglers, they called them, easy targets. Many bomber crews watched helplessly as crippled planes drifted out of formation, their engines sputtering, until a swarm of enemy fighters tore into them. The radio would come alive with mayday calls, sometimes ending mid-sentence. For those still in formation, the return leg tested endurance. The oxygen masks pressed against their faces, the smell of sweat, metal, and oil heavy in the air. Frost built up on their goggles. The endless drone of engines filled the silence. Some men drifted into uneasy sleep, only to jerk awake when the plane lurched through turbulence or when flak exploded below. Then came the English Channel, that narrow stretch of water that meant survival. Seeing it from the air brought a flood of relief. Home was near. Damaged planes limped toward the coast, some trailing smoke, others gliding on one engine. The crews knew that if they could just make it to friendly skies, they'd have a chance. Rescue boats patrolled below, ready to pull survivors from the freezing water. At last, the airfields of England came into view, long runways dotted with ambulances and fire trucks. Pilots called for landing clearance, and one by one, the bombers touched down. Some barely made it, their landing gear collapsing on impact. Ground crews rushed out to meet them, counting bullet holes, patching metal, and pulling wounded men from the wreckage. And yet, even with the relief of survival, there was no celebration. Every crew looked to the horizon and wondered who hadn't made it back. Empty spaces in the mess hall told the story. Tomorrow, another mission awaited, and they would fly again, because that's what they did.
When the bombers returned, the airfield came alive. Mechanics swarmed over the battered planes, counting bullet holes and patching the torn aluminum skins. Medics carried out the wounded, stretcher after stretcher, while chaplains quietly comforted those waiting for word about missing friends. For the crews who made it back in one piece, the relief was indescribable, but it was always mixed with guilt. Survival meant facing the empty bunks in the barracks that would never be filled again. After each mission, the men went through debriefing, a tense, detailed meeting where intelligence officers asked about everything: flak positions, enemy fighters, target accuracy, and weather conditions. Some spoke clearly, their voices still shaking from adrenaline. Others just sat in silence, staring at the floor. Coffee was poured, cigarettes were lit, and the smell of exhaustion filled the room. Once the paperwork was done, they could finally rest. Showers were rare luxuries, but hot food was waiting. Eggs, toast, maybe even steak if the cooks had managed to get supplies. Some men went straight to bed, collapsing still half-dressed. Others gathered in the mess hall, talking in low voices about the mission, trying to laugh, but always glancing around at the empty chairs. The downtime between missions was strange, a mix of boredom and dread. They played cards, wrote letters home, or listened to the radio for news from the front. They joked about Berlin or bust, but everyone knew the odds. In 1943, bomber crews had a 1 in 3 chance of surviving their 25-mission tour. Every takeoff could be their last. Still, there were brief moments of peace. Pilots visited nearby towns where local pubs welcomed them like heroes. The laughter, the music, the warmth, it was a world away from the cold metal fuselage of a bomber. But even there, the war lingered. Every pilot carried with him the faces of the men who didn't make it back. At night, as engines roared outside and new crews arrived to replace the lost, the veterans stared up at the dark English skies and wondered how many more missions they could endure. The next morning, orders would come down again. Target, Bremen, Hamburg, or Berlin. They would eat breakfast quietly, check their flight gear, and climb back into the same planes that had nearly killed them days before, because duty demanded it. They weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting to end the nightmare once and for all. By the spring of 1945, the thunder of war in Europe was beginning to fade. The relentless bombing campaigns had taken their toll. Germany's factories were shattered, its oil supply crippled, and its cities scarred beyond recognition. The skies that had once swarmed with flak and fighters grew eerily quiet. For the bomber crews who had survived, it was finally time to breathe again. The mission slowed and then stopped. The last sorties were almost ceremonial, dropping food to the starving civilians of the Netherlands or leaflets announcing Germany's surrender. When the news came that the war in Europe was over, airfields across England erupted in celebration. Men who had spent years staring death in the face finally let go, cheering, crying, hugging anyone within reach. The sense of relief was overwhelming. But beneath the joy, there was also a heavy silence. Victory had come at a price no one could fully measure. Tens of thousands of bomber airmen never came home. Entire crews vanished without a trace, their planes buried somewhere beneath the soil of Europe or at the bottom of the sea.
For those who lived, every celebration was tempered by the ghosts of those who didn't. When they finally returned home, the survivors found that the world had moved on, but they hadn't. Families saw the medals and the uniforms, but could never imagine the fear, the noise, the endless cold. Many airmen spoke little of their missions. Some boxed away their flight jackets and never flew again. Others found solace in reunions, sitting quietly with the only people who could truly understand what it was like to live and almost die in those skies. In the decades that followed, historians would debate the strategy and ethics of the bombing war, but the courage of the men who flew those missions was never in question. They faced near impossible odds, day after day, in defense of a cause greater than themselves. The war taught them the true meaning of endurance, not just physical survival, but the strength to keep flying when everything inside screamed to stop. They were ordinary men who did extraordinary things, and when peace finally came, they carried the memory of their fallen brothers with them forever. In the cold, thin air above Europe, they had written one of the most enduring stories of World War II, not just of machines and battles, but of human spirit, sacrifice, and the will to see a better world beyond the clouds.